Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to a new week of programming here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien. It is a pleasure to be with you on this Monday. It's turned out to be a rather snowy Monday here in Appalachia, but it's due to end this afternoon, and the accumulation is not bad. It's 3 or 4 inches at most, but again, it makes travel very, very difficult. And speaking of travel, let me say, because I want to make sure that I spend a moment today and tomorrow as well, making listeners aware that we will not be doing a program Wednesday. I'm traveling to New England and will not be back. And so consequently, we'll be doing previous program. Agnes will be running previous programs on Wednesday and also the 3 programs next week, because I won't be able to get back until next Wednesday. And so what that means is we'll be back on the air 2 weeks from today, the following Monday. So I'll mention this again, but I don't want anybody to be surprised by it. And please know that there's nothing wrong. We're kind of doing some emergency babysitting for my wife's son, who is in the military and is deployed, and his wife is being sent out of town for her job, and ultimately there are 3 young children there, oldest being 10, that need somebody to care for them. So that's what we're doing. So my wife will be up there for about 12 days. I won't be that long, but I did want everybody to know that. There's so much happening. And all of it in one way or another is related to the Constitution. So I don't know if it's really funny. I mentioned in for several months now our Facebook page, and mentioned that I do try to put postings on there periodically to kind of keep up. But over the last 3 or 4 days, I must have put 8 or 10 different postings on our Facebook page. Because the material is just coming fast and furious. I've never quite seen anything like it. All of it, it seems to me, is very pertinent to this program because, as I mentioned, either indirectly or directly, it's related to the Constitution. And this weekend and the protests that are going on, that have been going on this weekend and continue to go on today, are no exception. We are 2 weeks into the new well, this is the beginning of the second full week of the Trump administration from the inauguration a week ago Friday. Already, we've had 2 weekends of massive protests. Last week, the Women's March, of course. And then this week, we had, in the middle of the week, we had the Right to Life March in Washington, which was very, very well attended, of course. And then this weekend, we had protests at airports around the country and indeed around the world. Just before we came on the air today, I just caught a breaking news item that a petition signed by more than 1 million Brits in England is a petition to the government to not go through with the invitation to President Trump to visit the UK under the present circumstances because of the travel ban. And so on refugees, it's hard to tell exactly what the ban is on. One of the most interesting things, obviously, has been trying to get a handle on exactly what the policy says and what it doesn't say. It seems to change periodically, but that's one of the issues that I think we'd spend a little bit of time on today, is going through that and trying to get a handle on exactly what it does say and what it doesn't say. But before we do that, I want to basically give everyone the basic information, the phone number and my email address, and of course the address for our Facebook page. the phone number, which would give you the opportunity to be on the air, and I know everybody has things they would like to say and throw out there for consideration during this active news period. This is absolutely incredible. There's so much going on, and a lot of it is, very honestly, I don't think very good. It is not good. In fact, it's quite disturbing. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me via email, I would really enjoy hearing from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And our Facebook page. If you go to the homepage for Facebook, which is facebook.com, and at the search box at the top, if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be into our Facebook page, and there are a number of postings there. And as I say, over the last 3 or 4 days, I've probably put 7 or 8 postings on our Facebook page. In fact, it was becoming links to particular articles and issues on a number of different things. So the irony is, in trying to put together a program like today's, which is our full 2-hour get-together here at the Virtual Center, it's a little bit difficult because you almost have to deal with some of the things that are going on. And there are so many things going on that it's really kind of difficult to find a common theme or to get your arms around essentially what's going on. And I'm going to make an effort to do a little bit of that. But it seems to me that we would be violating our mission here at the Virtual Center if we didn't address some of the issues that are going on, because so many of them are directly related to the Constitution. And of course, it came out this morning in a tweet that President Trump will be naming a nominee for the Supreme Court on Tuesday evening, tomorrow at 8 p.m. And there are 3 names that have been thrown out there. And already the media is beginning to speculate as to which of the 3 probably has the best chance of being the nominee. One of them is more than the other 2. It looks like all 3 of them will elicit opposition among Democrats on the Senate during the nomination procedure. There's absolutely no question. But one of them in particular is going to be a very, very difficult one to get through. But anyway, so that indicates that the news just continues to happen and will continue this week as well. One of the items that I put on Facebook, and it kind of relates to this weekend in a lot of ways. I posted a link to Maureen Dowd's column out of Sunday's New York Times. It's a pretty much, for lack of a better way of expressing it, it really amounts to a psychological profile of President Trump, an effort on her part to try to get a handle or to describe exactly what we're dealing with, or in the personality of Donald Trump. And it's an excellent job. Not that you can basically, I'm not in a position where I can validate the psychological profile, the substance of the psychological profile itself. But many of the things she says are things that we've seen and we continue to see. And I really believed that it was a piece that was worth people's attention. She makes reference to Donald Trump as, quote, the 70-year-old 7-year-old. And on Facebook, made a comment that seems to say an awful lot about the article to come, because indeed it is a psychological analysis. I wrote this piece and put the posting on Facebook Saturday evening, as all of us were watching the protests in airports, watching protesters march and watching attorneys sitting on the floor in many cases in airport lobbies, trying to provide some sort of legal advice and putting together legal briefs in order to try to block the president's executive order. It's very interesting. One of the things that occurred to me was that Republicans, if you'll remember, were making a big thing out of President Obama's use of executive orders in the last year of his administration. And many of them were talking about the fact that it was almost like we no longer had a Republican government, but rather so much was coming out of the White House in the form of executive orders that it almost appeared that we had some sort of a king or a monarch because of his taking so many actions unilaterally. The fact of the matter is, in the first week of the Trump administration, that process has actually been speeded up. There are actually proportionally more executive orders coming out of the White House, and some of them, of course, were cancellations of executive orders that President Obama had issued. But of course, some of them are new ones, and obviously the one that got all the attention this weekend was the refugee ban, the permanent ban on refugees from Syria, the 90-day ban on refugees from the 7 identified nations, and the president's efforts to try to make the case that this is not a Muslim ban. This is merely the president using his executive discretion in order to protect the security of the nation, which is his job. And the president has gone out of his way to deny that this is a Muslim ban, because as such, it would be blatantly unconstitutional. It would be discrimination on the basis of religion. The fact of the matter is, and this is one of the things I put on Facebook, the fact of the matter is, if you read or you look at the details of the ban, it's very obvious that it is a Muslim ban. And the reason I say that is because of the provision in the executive order that makes it possible to excuse from it religious minorities in the countries identified. Basically, all of these nations are majority Muslim nations. So if you make it possible for religious minorities in these nations to be excused from the ban, then in effect the only ones where the only religion where the ban sticks is Islam, are Muslims. So contrary then to what the president is saying, that really does amount to a Muslim ban. And to top it all off, on Sunday morning, Rudy Giuliani reported that President Trump had contacted him and basically said, we're about to go with the Muslim ban. What do we need to do in order to make it legal? When I heard that, that was after this posting on the Maureen Dowd article. It was Sunday morning that this happened. But I was stunned that the president would openly acknowledge, and of course all through the campaign, he talked about a Muslim ban. It's very clear then that this ban is worded in such a way that it's intended to be legally legal. In other words, it's intended to not violate the letter of the law, the Constitution. But clearly, it violates the spirit of the law. And with this exchange with Rudy Giuliani, Mr. President Trump has acknowledged that what he was doing, or planning to do at that time, was indeed a Muslim ban, which is a violation of the Constitution of the United States. So there we have it. As we know, a number of judges issued stay orders and restraining orders on the portions of the executive order, primarily related to the deportation of those people who were caught up in it. And while the administration has gone to the nth degree to try to suggest that while some people, a relatively few people, have been inconvenienced, the fact of the matter is it's not that big a deal. That's the argument that Sean Spicer took this morning on television, and other people have, Kellyanne Conway and others have done as well. Kellyanne Conway makes the point that yesterday, just in that 24-hour period, 325,000 people came into the airports of the United States. And those detained totaled something around 109. And as of now, midday on Monday, those 109 people have been admitted, are no longer being detained. So in a sense, what she's saying is that's less than 1%. And those people are being inconvenienced. But when the issue is national security, inconvenience is to be expected. And so the debate continues to rage over whether, in fact, it is a legal executive order or not. And I think the testimony of the president himself pretty much, to me at least, indicates that it's not. There may be an effort to frame it, and of course that's what Rudy Giuliani's job was to be. How can we frame this thing so it's legal? But in reality, the president took up the issue with clearly the full intent to make it a Muslim ban. So that's what we're dealing with. It's hard to believe we're only 10 days into the new administration. One has to wonder where we go from here. Let me quote one of the more relevant paragraphs from Maureen Dowd's article on the sociological or psychological profile. I said sociological, I mean psychological profile of Donald Trump. She said, "It took us years to find out that Richard Nixon was swilling scotch, eating dog biscuits, talking to the White House portraits, and blowing up the Vietnam peace talks in 1968 to help his election bid. It took us years to find that out, that despite that deep, reassuring voice, Dick Cheney was a demented megalomaniac. But with President Trump, it's all right out there. The tantrums, the delusions, the deceptions, the self-doubts, and overcompensation," unquote. I think that paragraph and that last sentence and the adjectives or the descriptions of President Trump that she includes, tantrums, delusions, deceptions, self-doubts, overcompensation, kind of gives us an idea, it seems to me, of what the entire article is about, which is really why I recommended it, because I think everybody needed to reflect upon this, since it indeed is coming out of the White House. it's important to recognize, and I think all of us do, that those people who were most ardent, most agitated, if you will, in their support of Donald Trump's election to the presidency, are trying to find ways to justify this by saying all of these things that he's doing are things that he said he would do. That, in other words, he's merely fulfilling campaign promises, which is what citizens expect presidential candidates who win to do. But the reality is there's so much more to it than that. And one of the things that is giving the media fodder, if you will, is that some of it is being done without apparently the kind of foresight and planning and research necessary to make sure these actions are legal and go as planned. This particular ban this weekend, for example, clearly created all sorts of problems and divisions within the administration itself. It's kind of unbelievable, some of the details of what seems to be going on, the kinds of things that the media is speculating upon that are going on within the administration, which hasn't even fully been assembled yet. A number of the president's nominees to particular cabinet posts have yet to go through the hearings, let alone have yet to be approved. One of the things that bothered me about this particular issue is that the personality of the president seems to have so much of an impact on what's happening. I would expect, that the people around him would, to a degree at least, be able to contain, direct, guide, control, or whatever, his behavior. But as yet, we've seen little evidence of that. In fact, we've seen just the opposite. We've seen a lot of people whom we would look for some sort of restraint or constraint on the behavior and the commentary of the president seem to be laying low, ducking for cover. I thought it was very interesting, for example, that last evening, Sunday evening, the White House asked two members of the administration to meet with the press in order to answer questions and explain the details of the executive order banning refugees from Syria and the rest of it. And the two people who did meet with the press and agreed to do it, but at the same time insisted that their names not be used, that they remain anonymous. So it almost seems like people are kind of reluctant to be identified with anything that could come back to bite them. It's not a healthy situation. Maureen Dowd quotes Michael D'Antonio, one of Trump's biographers. And he said the fact that the press corps is captive in the White House and can be dragged into these executive order signings is, for him, like mainlining heroin, unquote. The fact that the president has almost an unending access to the media, that these people can be assembled at a moment's call, so to speak. The fact that he can use Twitter and communicate virtually with millions of citizens at the same time, criticize his opponents, support those who are supporting him, means that the political spigot is never turned off. And I think that this is very, very important. Before I get off this particular issue on the Maureen Dowd piece and on the psychological profile of the president, I'm going to do a little bit more with that in a moment. But I wanted to make reference to the Republican retreat in Philadelphia at the end of last week. This was after our programs ended. Our last program was Wednesday. And this retreat was Thursday and Friday in Philadelphia. One of the things that I thought would happen at this retreat would be the emergence into a more prominent role of the Republican leadership of Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell. It seemed to me that the purpose of the retreat would be exactly that. What was the Republican majority in both houses about to do or planning to do in relation to some of the actions that are coming out of the White House? Because so far, in the first 10 days of this administration, all the initiative, all the action is coming out of the executive branch, which is quite interesting because that's exactly what Republicans accused President Obama of in the last months of his term. The reality is that while there is similarity in the use of executive orders, there's quite a difference. The major difference being that Obama's was at the end of his administration and Trump's use of executive orders is at the very front end. And one of the things that's becoming noticeable by its absence is any kind of initiative coming out of Congress from the new Republican majority. Rather, what is coming from the leadership of the Republican Party is almost total support for pretty much everything that the president has done. And I can specifically mention that Paul Ryan, indeed to the media, made the point when questions were raised by the media about some of these executive orders. Paul Ryan made the point that the president is merely following through on his campaign promises so far, and that for the most part, he and McConnell both support what he's doing. So it doesn't seem like the kind of controls or the kind of guidance that many of us expected from the Republican majority in the House is materializing at all. In fact, one of the things that Paul Ryan said to the media on Friday, which I thought was very, very relevant, was that many of the things that the Republican majority is working on are going to be slow and deliberate. He was specifically talking about repeal of Obamacare. And his point was that it's going to be something we've got to get right. So therefore, we're talking about something that could well take close to the first year of the Trump presidency in order to get it right. So in essence, the Republican leadership is indicating that it plans to move very, very carefully and very, very slowly, which suggests that the president is going to be out there doing his thing all the time with very little guidance, very little control, and very little effort to synthesize what he's doing with what Congress will end up doing. I also think that with a few exceptions, we're not hearing a whole lot from the Democratic minority in Congress either, other than a commitment to try to block and to try to use whatever powers they can get as a minority to address some of these things. Let me mention one more thing about this latest executive order, the ban. It came on Holocaust Remembrance Day. The White House put out a statement on the 28th, this Saturday, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, in which no mention was made of the Jews in connection with the Holocaust. Many people were concerned about that. I was. One of the postings that I put on Facebook basically focused on those who would deny the reality, the historical reality of the Holocaust. And it seemed to me like the president's omission of any mention of the Jews on Holocaust Remembrance Day was serious and significant, because it seemed to be in line with those who have been trying for a long time to sell the idea that the Holocaust didn't really happen. One of my closest friends is the wife of a historian that I taught with for several years here in southern West Virginia. She is a Holocaust survivor. I can remember inviting her to address a number of my classes, my history classes, because she pretty much was devoting her life to sharing the reality of the Holocaust with young people, going to schools, K through 12 schools and college classes, and doing everything she could to keep the word out there about the horrors of the Holocaust, because she knew that there were efforts to deny it, to try to push it so far back in our collective memories that, in effect, it became, in the minds of many people, only a theory rather than established fact. She was really worried about this. And knowing her and feeling the way I do about her, I worried as well. And now this. Now the fact that on Holocaust Remembrance Day, the Jews were not mentioned. Jake Tapper of CNN on Saturday night reported that Hope Hicks, spokesperson for President Trump, defended the White House statement and the omission of Jews from the White House's statement of remembrance of the Holocaust. Hope Hicks said, and this is a quote, "The decision not to mention the Jews was deliberate, a way of demonstrating the inclusive approach of the Trump administration. Despite what the media reports, we are an incredibly inclusive group, and we took into account all of those who suffered. It was our honor to issue a statement in remembrance of this important day," unquote. So here's the spokesman for the president, Hope Hicks, basically suggesting that the omission of Jews from the remembrance statement coming out of the White House was not an omission, it was deliberate. It was a deliberate effort not to deny that the Jews suffered, but to make the point that other people suffered in World War II as well. And so what you are effectively doing is scrubbing the meaning of the Holocaust by taking the Jews out of it. This prompted an article on Saturday, which was published on Sunday, by John Podhoretz. John Podhoretz is a prominent historian and commentator on international affairs, a prominent defender of Israel and of the Holocaust. And he was obviously stunned by this statement from Hope Hicks from the White House. He points out that there is a body of opinion in the country, and clearly within the Trump administration as well, who have long made it clear that they're tired of what they consider a self-centered Jewish claim to being the great victims of the Nazis. It's an alienated sense that the Jews are trying to reap the benefit by saying they are the most abused group at the hands of the Nazis. And they have become part of what many people refer to as Holocaust deniers. John Podhoretz makes the point that he wrote the address delivered by President Reagan in 1988 at the laying of the cornerstone of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And he realized that even then, there was this sense that there were people who were committed to denying the historical reality of the Holocaust. And Podhoretz says in his article, I bring these things up to say that the Hope Hicks statement does not arrive without precedent. It is rather the culmination of something, the culmination of decades of ill feeling that seems to center on the idea that the Jews have somehow made unfair use of the Holocaust and that it should not belong to them. Podhoretz makes the point that it must belong to them because the extermination of the Jews as a people, as a religion, is indeed what the Holocaust was about. And then Podhoretz quotes President Reagan at the laying of the cornerstone of the Holocaust Museum in 1988. And this is President Reagan's statement or speech at that time. I think all of us here are aware of those, even among our own countrymen, who have dedicated themselves to the disgusting task of minimizing or even denying the truth of the Holocaust. This act of intellectual genocide must not go unchallenged, and those who advance these views must be held up to the scorn and wrath of all good and thinking people in this nation and across the world, unquote. President Reagan specifically spoke to the Holocaust deniers and basically called them out for what they are trying to do. They are literally trying to rewrite history. And as he said, we have to trust that thinking people throughout the world will take issue with this and stand up and defend the Holocaust for what history tells us that it really was. And now this weekend, we're dealing with the Trump administration falling into the same behavior. One has to wonder about the role that Stephen Bannon played in the drafting of this remembrance statement coming out of the White House. Because Stephen Bannon's role as director of Breitbart, the right-wing alt-right news agency, is famous for these kinds of statements. This sounds very much like Stephen Bannon. I'm not the only one that's saying that. A lot of people are saying that. They are also commenting on the fact that Stephen Bannon co-authored President Trump's inaugural address, in which he talked about the carnage that is America, that is American cities. And there's an awful lot of Stephen Bannon that helps us to understand and explain some of the behavior that's taking place by the president during the first 10 days of his administration. It seemed to me, when I posted these things on Facebook, it seemed to me unforgivable that the administration was doing this. Not only that, but that this ban on refugees, this ban that's targeted towards Muslims, would be issued on Holocaust Remembrance Day, of all days. Of all days. It's very obvious that it should have been, I'm going to use this word because we see it everywhere, it should have been vetted more carefully before it was issued. It wasn't. And so what we are finding, or what we are seeing, are spokesmen for the administration rapidly trying to circle the wagons, defend what they did. And the fact of the matter is, what's happening today, Monday, after this weekend, is that it's clear the Trump administration has chosen to defy the judge's stays on the application of certain aspects of this executive order. In spite of the fact that a number of federal judges have spoken, the Trump administration is in fact touting, bragging on the fact that it is pretty much disregarding what the judges have said, and that every aspect of the executive order is currently in place and being implemented. So it's very obvious that this is an issue that's going to have to be decided at some point in the courts. It's unbelievable. You know, I mean, I'm just stunned. I mean, I can't even, I'm listening to myself say these things, and I find it hard to deal with. I find it hard to believe that there's so much happening that is so predictable. And one of the things that I think makes Maureen Dowd's column relevant is that the psychological profile she tries to portray, she tries to lay out for us, really does seem to fit the behavior. At least an awful lot of the behavior. It's hard to deny the validity of some of the conclusions she draws. One of the things I put on Facebook, and this is the real issue with all of this, it seems to me. A lot of the protesters are saying this. This whole matter defies the realities of what this country has always been about. It denies the realities that for how long this nation could brag on its open, unarmed borders. The fact that we were an open nation, that we welcome the world's oppressed. It is so ironic that the very people that this executive order seeks to protect us from are fleeing exactly that kind of terrorism. That's what brings them here. Most of them don't have any place to go. They've basically gotten out safely, assuming that this is a place where they always could come. And this administration seemingly has chosen to change all of that. In 1939, I posted this on my posting on Saturday night, dealing with this, with the Holocaust Remembrance Day and the unfortunate fact that this refugee ban would be released on the very same day that the Holocaust is to be remembered. In 1939, in Miami, a German ship, the St. Louis, was denied entry It had over 900 refugees from the Nazis, Jewish refugees from the Nazis on board. They literally were coming here to escape execution. And the St. Louis was turned around and forced to go back to Germany. And history tells us that almost all of these passengers ended up as victims in the Nazi concentration camps. This is behavior, a form of denial of the horrendous reality of the Holocaust that this nation has been trying to make up for ever since 1939. It seems to me what this ban this past weekend tells us is that with the arrival or the emergence of this new administration, the nation has pretty well concluded that it's no longer necessary to make up for anything. Rather, the choice instead is to scrub the Holocaust of all mention of Jews, and to suggest that while Jews suffered, so did a lot of other people in World War II, and that Holocaust Remembrance Day is a remembrance of all of those who suffered. I think the irony is beyond the need to mention, but I'll mention it anyway. And that is the affinity between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel. You'll remember that the Republicans invited Netanyahu to speak to Congress without ever informing the White House, President Obama. You'll recall also 50 senators signed a statement against President Obama's Iran treaty, nuclear treaty, and basically asserted in that letter that they did not intend to abide by it, and that one of the first things they would do if they took over control of government, which they have, is to undo that Iranian treaty. Donald Trump, throughout the campaign, kept referring to it as the worst piece of diplomatic negotiation ever in the history of the country. We gave away everything and we got nothing, Donald Trump said. Also, President Trump, you'll recall last week, came out against the two-state solution to the Arab-Israeli, to the Palestinian situation. And as a result of Trump's inaugural, Netanyahu was able to announce the very next day that Israel was going ahead with 3,000 new homes in the disputed areas of the settlements. Disputed territory claimed by the Palestinians was going to experience the buildings of Jewish homes. And Netanyahu made the point that Israel was doing this, felt that they could do this because of the election victory of Donald Trump. So on the one hand, we have Trump's affinity with Netanyahu, with Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian controversy. And at the same time, we have this. One of the things I could not resist saying is, where is Benjamin Netanyahu when you need him? Because I can't imagine that he would be able to stand the statement by Hope Hicks that the White House's exclusion of the mention of Jews in the Holocaust Remembrance Statement coming out of the White House was deliberate. I haven't heard anything as yet about that. I can't imagine that Netanyahu will let it slide. It is so unlike him. I guess we'll have to wait and see on that one. One of the issues seems like we just go from one thing to the other here. I'm looking through my materials here. There's one particular thing I wanted to address. Well, let me begin with this, because I with the time left in this first hour, we've got about 6 minutes left in this first hour. This would be a good point to kind of put this refugee ban to bed for the day, at least. One of the things that I found it difficult to do was get a handle of it on exactly what the executive order said. It was so complex. Different people had different things. Some people said it was a ban on Muslims. Other people said it wasn't. The White House, of course, has denied that it was, even though the president acknowledged that it is. And the 7 countries, Muslim countries that were named, and all of it. So basically, I was very, very eager to get my hands on something that told us exactly what this executive order says. I found it in my research this morning. First, the issue of no entry to this country at all. Trump's executive order temporarily suspends all immigration for citizens of 7 majority Muslim countries for 90 days. The 7 countries are Iraq, Syria, Iran, Sudan, Libya, Somalia, and Yemen. Basically, then, all immigration from those 7 countries is suspended for at least 90 days. The order also calls for Homeland Security and State Department officials, along with the Director of National Intelligence, to review whatever information the government has on vetting would-be visitors to the United States. The order says that the government will give countries 60 days in order to start providing that kind of information to citizens of those countries who plan to come here. In other words, if we know and we identify what we're going to need to know in order for these people to be admitted, then the home countries need to make sure that whoever comes from their countries to ours has this information, because that's what we're going to be demanding in order for them to come in. Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly stated on Sunday that those people who had U.S. resident green cards will not be barred from re-entering the U.S. Yesterday, one of the issues was that some of the people being detained at airports held green cards, which meant they had already been vetted, they had already been approved for admission to this country, and now weren't being allowed to get back in. I saw an interview this morning with a member of parliament, a Muslim member of parliament in London, who has 2 sons who are students at Princeton. And they were due to come home to Great Britain, to London. But the father's fear was that once they did that, they wouldn't be able to get back into the country for the 90 days. And thereby, they would miss the whole semester at Princeton. They would miss so much of the semester that it would affect their educational standing. Just one example of how this thing can affect people's lives. So green cards holders will be, according to John Kelly, Homeland Security Secretary, admitted. Those denied entry for 90 days at least are the people from the 7 targeted countries. In terms of refugees, President Trump ordered a 4-month suspension of America's refugee program in order to provide time to review how refugees are vetted before they're allowed to resettle in the United States. Also, as part of Trump's order, he cuts the number of refugees that the United States will accept this year more than half, from 50 to 50,000 people. In the last budget year, the U.S. accepted 84,995 refugees. The halt to refugee admission does include exceptions for people claiming religious persecution, so long as their religion is a minority faith in their own country. That's critical. People coming to the United States to relocate who claim religious persecution and are members of a religious minority in their own countries can get in to this country. That obviously means Christians. Donald Trump made the point, in fact, in an interview on CNN News, not CNN News, CBN, Christian Broadcasting Network. President Trump made the point that he wanted to do everything he can do to help Christians who he felt were being treated unfairly in many of these Muslim-dominated countries. All of this put together, it seems to me, makes it absolutely unquestioned that this executive order constitutes a Muslim ban and therefore violates the Constitution of the United States. Trump's order directs the State Department to stop issuing visas to Syrian nationals and halts all processing of Syrian refugees. This will remain in effect until the president determines that enough security changes have been made so that would-be terrorists would not be able to come in under the radar, so to speak. The president's order did not spell out exactly what vetting these folks would involve. But this particular piece, which I've got out of the Boston Globe actually, explains the vetting process during the Obama administration. During Obama's years, vetting for refugees included in-person interviews overseas, where they provided biographical data about themselves, including their families, friends, social or political activities, employment, phone numbers, email accounts, and more. They also provided biometric information, including fingerprints. Syrians were subject to additional classified controls that administration officials at the time declined to describe. In other words, the Obama administration had in place a fairly extensive vetting procedure. The people coming into this country have been vetted thoroughly. Many of them have been in process for a couple of years. It seems hard to believe that this administration could come up with anything new to make that process work better. And of course, the result of all of this is that demonstrations, not only in this country, but around the world, have begun to taking place. Leaders of Great Britain and Germany joined other American allies in criticizing the entry ban, voicing anger and dismay. President Trudeau of Canada welcomed those who would be denied admission to the United States, welcomed them to Canada. And lo and behold, this morning, there was a shooting at a mosque in Quebec. From what I understand, before we went on the air, 6 people were killed and numerous others were injured, some of them seriously. This is awful. The situation is awful. People are screaming at each other. They are not talking. There's a sense of refusal to believe what other people say. There's a sense of believing, there's a sense amongst many people that there's no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as fact. I really believe we're in quite a period, and it scares me. We've reached the top of the hour. We've actually gone a little bit beyond it. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back and finish our program. Please stay with us. We will not be long. Thank you. Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I guess it's important to underline civic responsibility today as well as Constitution. Because with the protests going on, I mean, there are those who seriously question these things, and there is an effort on the part of some to suggest that most of these are lifelong protesters who basically get their kicks by going out there and disrupting things. And then there are others, of course, who point to the situations which seem to bring these protesters out. So, again, the title of this particular of this center, the Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, indeed entails both of those. The nature of our republic, the nature of our constitutional system, suggests a degree of vigilance on the part of the citizenry, which is necessary to make it go. We looked at that. We looked at an awful lot of James Madison and Hamilton's explanations from the Federalist Papers of citizen responsibility in this republic, and there are some serious questions amongst a lot of people as to whether, in fact, that is indeed that wisdom is being ignored of late. But be that as it may. Welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center. If you have been with us since the beginning of our program today, I want to thank you for staying with us. Of course, the vast majority of it was focused on the executive order that came out this weekend, banning Syrian refugees and banning the right of residents of 7 named Muslim countries to come to the United States was challenged yesterday and precipitated protests and reports and legal briefs and a number of other things. That's what we talked about in our first hour. I think that's pretty much to be expected. I do thank you for staying with us, and I can't tell you how important some of these things are to constantly focus upon and reiterate and call attention to. They are very, very, very important, I think. And I think we're all becoming more and more appreciative of that as the days go. I was going to say weeks, but we've only had one. And already we are looking at a number of challenges that raise serious constitutional questions. And I don't doubt that there will be more. For those of you just joining us, I want to thank you for your continued support, not only of this program, but of the Head On Radio Network and the efforts of Bob Kincaid and Agnes and those folks to keep alternative programming like this on the air, especially during these troubled times. I would like to make you aware of our phone number and invite you to use it to make yourself heard on our program. If you call this phone number, you'll go into the Head On Radio Network. You get into the Horn, the Head On Radio Network studios. Agnes is there, and she'll get you on the air momentarily. The phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with us that way, is waobrien906 @gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. And I do especially call your attention to our Facebook page. And I say that because over the last 3 or 4 days, I have posted so many different links to articles related to not only this topic, but to other topics as well. The executive order, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, the Maureen Dowd article, which we touched upon in our first hour, an effort at the psychological analysis or profile of President Trump, in an effort to try to explain a little bit of what is happening and why it might be happening. Again, I'm not validating the accuracy of the analysis so much as I am recommending the quality of the writing and the presentation. Maureen Dowd's presentation is just absolutely delightful. And given the topic and given the significance of the topic, as an effort to understand today's news, it seems to me to be a very, very important piece of reading, and I recommend that people do it. Also, there are a number of other postings on our website as well. One of those postings relates to the ongoing attack from this administration on the media. There's absolutely no question that when spokesmen for the Trump administration talk about their opponents, the other side, they're not talking so much about Democrats as they are about the media. One of the other things that occurred this week, I'm sure many of you already know, is Stephen Bannon's call to the New York Times and his recommendation to the media that it keep its mouth shut for a while and listen. A number of spokesmen, not only for the New York Times, but networks, media, broadcast networks as well, have made the point that Mr. Bannon needs to take a look at the Constitution of the United States, because the whole idea of a definite role for the media in bringing information to the public in this particular republic is constitutionally protected. It's no accident that the First Amendment to the Constitution involves the right to free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion. And all of these issues, all of these First Amendment freedoms, if you will, in one way or another are coming under question and scrutiny in the last few days because of the behavior coming out of in this administration, coming out of the White House. In response to this persistent effort of President Trump to constantly criticize the media, a former White House correspondent for CNN, Jessica Yellen, many of you may have seen her. I know I kind of remember her as well. On the 26th, which was last Thursday, Jessica Yellen wrote a piece in which he advocated a very different role, a unique role for CNN. Her feeling is the opportunity for CNN to pretty much define itself as unique, to separate it from all the other media outlets, cable networks, television networks, and all the rest of it. What she's calling for is for CNN to return to a kind of investigative, objective, Walter Cronkite style reporting and journalism that CNN was originally created to perform, but since has gotten away from. She quotes CNN's founder, Ted Turner, on the impact that he saw for CNN when he first created it. Turner said the following: "We put journalism first. That's how we built CNN into something the world wanted to watch," he said. His concern is that quarterly earnings obsessed corporate owners would not adhere to that kind of investigative journalism. And that's the whole point of her presentation. Because the media tends to be controlled by corporate owners obsessed with quarterly earnings for shareholders, this, Yellen says, instantly shifts the role of the media from taking risks to taking profits. Yellen's point is that this is exactly what happened. And she doesn't spare CNN for this at all. In fact, she made the point that during the campaign, CNN made what she calls a Faustian agreement, a Faustian deal with Donald Trump and Donald Trump's campaign. CNN pretty much believed, acknowledged that Donald Trump would receive as much TV time as he needed, and the payoff for CNN would be the audience that Donald Trump would bring. In other words, CNN basically, according to Yellen, during this campaign, backed away from its own principles, backed away from its traditions. What she is advocating is that CNN become an independent network engaged in old-fashioned investigative journalism, which is really the role that our Constitution defines for the press, for the media. And of course, if you look at it, you can begin to see there is a proposal on the table for a merger between Time Warner and AT&T, a merger priced at $85 million. The rationale is the need to compete with the other mega media outlets. When you see the whole list, Yellen presents the whole list, you begin to appreciate how serious this issue is. Obviously, the issue at hand is Time Warner and AT&T. And it's important to know that CNN is owned by Time Warner. If you remember, they bought Ted Turner out, bought CNN away from Ted Turner. So now it's CNN, Time Warner. But who are its competition? What are the competition? What is the competition? Excuse me. That CNN and Time Warner confront. NBC Comcast, CBS Viacom, ABC Disney, Fox News, 21st Century Fox. NBC Comcast, CBS Viacom, ABC Disney, Fox, 21st Century Fox, CNN, Time Warner. Now Time Warner wants to merge with AT&T, or AT&T wants to buy out Time Warner. What Yellen is arguing for instead is the traditional role of investigative journalism that all of these media outlets and conglomerates seem to have lost. It's important to mention, and the reason I mention this is not only because I think the article that Chris Yellen writes is an excellent treatment of the whole idea of investigative journalism. It's an article worth reading. It was in the New York Times on the 26th, which was last Thursday. So if you go to the New York Times website, type in archives, one of the options it'll give you is within the last 7 days. And if you go to the last 7 days and you look for the article by Chris Yellen on CNN, you will find this particular piece. It's an excellent piece on the whole nature of investigative journalism. One of the issues that really got me about this particular article is that much of what Chris Yellen is advocating CNN do as an independent network returning to traditional investigative journalism is what NPR does. Those who are regular listeners of NPR know what I'm talking about. The news broadcasts are more substantive, they're more analytical, they're more informative, they tend to be balanced, presenting different sides of the same issues. The first thing I thought of when I read Chris Yellen's piece was that what she's advocating for CNN is what NPR does. But then I began to appreciate the difference. And the major one is funding. CNN is publicly funded. It's funded by those who listen, as well as government, because government has concluded that public broadcasting provides a public service. But as we know, one of the budget priorities of the Trump administration is to eliminate public funding for public broadcasting. So the threat to funding, the inadequate nature of funding for NPR, basically makes it difficult, if not impossible, for NPR to perform the kind of investigative journalism that it tries to perform and does what I think is a very noble job at it. So in reality, what Chris Yellen is advocating for CNN is a much more focused, better funded approach to that kind of journalism. And I think it's very significant. One other piece, and I've been carrying this one all last week and I never got to it, but I do want to recommend it. It's an article published on the 23rd of January, which was early last week. It's in a series which regularly appears in the New York Times called The Stone, which is a periodic parade of articles primarily based on philosophy. This particular one is written by a philosopher named Karen Stohr, S-T-O-H-R. It is on contempt. I think all the things we've been talking about the behavior and the priorities and the apparent narcissism and all the rest of it that we're seeing in the behavior of President Trump. On the 23rd of January, the New York Times published its regular series called The Stone. And in it is Karen Stohr's article entitled Our New Age of Contempt. I marked this as one that we really had to at least talk about some here at the Virtual Center. Stohr points out, in relationship to contempt, that Immanuel Kant, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, once remarked that no man in his true senses is candid. basically, let me repeat that. No man in his true senses is candid. Translation, Kant is saying we never really see what people really are because people oftentimes hide it. What we are talking about here is what we call today political correctness. What this particular article in the Stone on contempt is about is the danger that the new emphasis on contempt poses to the social order, poses to the nation itself. Karen Storr points out, it wasn't that Kant didn't value truthfulness and sincerity in interactions with others. He did. But he realized that the stability and progress of moral and political community depends on our being able to restrain ourselves from expressing publicly whatever we happen to be thinking or feeling. What Kant is saying is the very basis of a community, of a society in which people must live together in peace and harmony, is that people need to be able to control and restrain themselves in their interactions with other people. And that's what we seem to be losing. Many of us call this civility. Many people pointed out that civility seemed to have been gone totally from this recent political campaign. The degree of attacks, the bitterness, the vitriol, even Donald Trump admitted that in his comments after the election was over with Hillary Clinton. He basically said during the transition that one of the reasons he didn't want to push the issue of Hillary's emails, the best thing to do is drop it, is because basically it was a bitter campaign. She said horrible things about me and I said horrible things about her. But the implication is that's the nature of the political game. That's where we're coming to. The result is, of course, that this idea of self-restraint is disappearing not only in our political campaigns, but throughout our society. People are saying horrible things about each other. If you regularly read Facebook, you know what I'm talking about. I can't tell you the number of people that I've seen that have abandoned Facebook because they don't like a particular person or the positions of a particular person. Oftentimes, these are people that have gotten along together for years. And all of a sudden now, the heat of disagreement has become so intense that people no longer want to communicate with these other people. Storr is basically suggesting that Immanuel Kant is basically pointing out the very basis of what makes a community. Self-control. People's willingness to not say certain things to other people that are sure to irritate them. It's a traditional cliche among marriages is that the more the better two people get to know one another, what they really learn is what not to say. Places they shouldn't go, the sensitive points. The points you stay away from if you want to avoid controversy. What Immanuel Kant is saying, no man in his true senses is candid, is that even though people may think things, it's important that they don't say them. Because if everybody starts to do that, you cease to have a functioning community. Karen Storr points out that contempt is a very dangerous thing, and we are seeing more and more of it. Not disagreement, not just competing differences of opinion. We're talking about outright contempt, one person for another, or one position toward another. And she points out that there's a real difference, and Kant was very aware of this, Immanuel Kant, that contempt is a very dangerous thing. It dehumanizes its target. It's one thing for me to disagree with you. It's another thing to dismiss you, to have total contempt for you. Basically, what I'm saying to you is, we used to argue and disagree, but now I've reached the point where I don't even want to communicate or interact with you at all. As far as I'm concerned, you no longer exist. So it's contempt. It basically, according to Karen Storr, contempt functions by shifting the targeted person from a participant relationship to an objective relationship. It aims to alter someone's status by diminishing their agency. It dehumanizes other people. It basically suggests that the other person is so inferior to you that they aren't even in a position to be honored with the opportunity to share their opinions with you. You no longer respect these people enough to even listen to their point of view. And of course, what she talks about, what Karen Storr talks about, is that it is the campaign, the administration of Donald Trump and his supporters that is causing much of this, but not all of it. She points out that Hillary Clinton's expression during the campaign about the basket of deplorables qualifies as contempt. Bullying is associated with contempt. So also is power. And this is important. When we talk about contempt between two people, we're talking about it on the assumption that the two people involved are relatively equal. But the fact of the matter is, if one side has much more power than the other, then the exchange of contempt is not the same. If you have the power and I have none, then what possibly could I gain by having contempt for you? But if you have the power over me and you have contempt for me, there's no way I can balance that. There's no way I can respond in kind. You can't return it in kind because the person who is showing the contempt has so much power that your effort at contempt becomes meaningless. That's what she's talking about, specifically about Donald Trump. Contempt toward him doesn't really have the same impact that his contempt for others has. And that's what makes contempt very, very dangerous to a society. Basically, what she is arguing is that what all of us need to do is reject contempt, is identify it when we see it, call it out for what it is, and reject it. Because if contempt becomes even more prevalent than it is now, it will literally rip our society apart. And that's what's happening. Before we went on the air today, Agnes and I were chatting about just this. It's not just Donald Trump that is guilty of these kinds of things. We're beginning to see people everywhere doing the same kinds of things. It's almost like all the controls have been taken off. It's almost like people suddenly are free to say what they really want to say, irrespective of how painful or how hurtful it is to other people. And that really destroys the very foundation of community. It makes it impossible for people to communicate ever again. It renders people permanently divided, creates permanent splits, makes it extremely difficult to patch up issues that come between people when the issues come down to a situation of pure contempt, of dismissing people, of dehumanizing people, of saying verbally that you don't really accept the legitimacy of other people to even argue with you. Once you do that, it becomes very difficult to fix it. What makes this particular issue politically sensitive, it seems to me, is that this seems to be one of the many character traits that we have seen through the campaign in the personality of Donald Trump. When he attacks, it's vicious. It's painful. He sets out to hurt. It's one thing to argue with people. It's one thing to become angry with other people. But the problem with it is that when it is reduced to trying to really hurt the other people, the other person, by rubbing sores that ought not to be rubbed, by going at areas and at people in their most vulnerable spots, by criticizing people in order to hurt them, and knowing how to do it in ways that hurt them the most. That means that the differences between people become irreparable, become so hard to fix, so hard ever again to patch up. And unfortunately, that seems to be an example of what we're seeing more and more in our society today. It's not fair, it's not right to blame Donald Trump for it, or Hillary Clinton for it, or the political campaign for it. But the fact of the matter is, all of it creates an environment, a sense of license, an idea that all the controls have been taken off. It's time, these folks say, it's time when people become honest with each other. Even though honesty can be painful. All of this is tied up with the political attacks, and I can remember all of this beginning, with Rush Limbaugh in the 90s. I can remember this. The attack on political correctness. the idea on people's the idea people had that there were certain positions or certain issues which had a generally accepted, expected position on. It was considered to be unhealthy and un-American to take issue with these things. You were expected to feel certain ways about certain things, not to say certain things, not to discuss certain topics. I can remember growing up, my dad saying all the time that you don't want to talk religion and you don't want to talk politics. And of course, the fact of the matter is, life sometimes can be pretty dull when you don't talk about any of those things. I've heard people tell me, I know I'm mean, I know I'm going to go to hell, but on the other hand, that's where most of the interesting people are. So, whatever. But anyway, this issue of the stone has unearthed this issue of contempt into today's society and what it is doing. And of course, again, if you replace it, instead of talking contempt, if you talk civility, yes, it's artificial, but it has benefits. And the benefits are that it makes it possible for people to continue living together in harmony rather than in turmoil. We've reached the point in our politics, in our two-party politics, where the two parties have stopped communicating with each other. The congressman or senator that is willing to work across the aisle, that is willing to find common ground on which to get things done, is becoming a rare breed in our national politics. When in fact the whole nature of the political system as created by the founders, the system itself was created to depend on that very foundation, on the willingness of people to communicate, to negotiate, to find compromise. When you stop talking, when you practice something remotely approaching contempt for the other side, then your ability to work with them ends. The splits become permanent. They become wider. They become more difficult to patch up. We're seeing it in our political system on the national level. We're seeing it in states. We're seeing the hostility. We have a situation here in our local politics, for example. The state, West Virginia, has gone from a blue state to clearly a red state, one of the most reddest states in the union, it turns out. And it's filtering all the way down to the municipal level and below, into county politics, town politics. And the result is that oftentimes the winners are coming in and dismissing all the people who held office under the previous administration. In other words, the turnover becomes total. I've heard of situations where people come into office on a Monday morning after having recently won an election and say all the people in this office are on notice that they are effectively terminated as of the 1st of next month or something like that. Basically, the implication is, I'm a newly elected person. I've got to get people that I can work with, and you're not one of them. It's very, very dangerous. It's a very, very negative situation. It doesn't bode well for the political community. It doesn't bode well for this particular political community above all others. Because obviously from Madison's Federalist number 10, we know that the whole idea of this system is to force people to come together, communicate, compromise, find common ground is the term that we often use today. And it's based on a degree of trust, on an element of faith. People need to trust each other in order to work with each other. The very nature of contempt is that it makes trust impossible. It creates bitterness and hostility, one person, one group, to another. It is not conducive to the nature of our political system as we understand it here at the Virtual Center. I think that going back to this article on the 23rd on contempt, this is one that everybody ought to read. I think it's that important. I think it's that informative. And I think it raises the kinds of issues and the kinds of questions that all of us need to think seriously about. Political correctness has become a swear word in the minds of many people. But the fact of the matter is, it had a purpose. It had a positive outcome. It doesn't mean that people's relationships with each other should be phony and artificial and superficial. It doesn't mean that at all. Rather, it means that there's a difference between honest disagreement, sharing and arguing out differences of opinion. Contempt makes that impossible. Unequal power between groups makes that impossible. In order for communication and consensus to be possible, there needs to be an element of trust and respect among people. Contempt and ideas related to contempt make that impossible. Attitudes, negative attitudes towards other groups of people because they're different, is extremely dangerous. And here we come full circle back to where we began our program today. What we're seeing in some of the legislation, in some of these executive orders coming out of the White House, under the heading of under the rubric of security, is a sense of a desire to discriminate, a sense of inequality that makes it impossible for people to positively communicate with each other. It appears that the priorities of the new administration are threatening to return to a world in which nations did not cooperate, they competed. A world in which nations didn't trust each other, they gained leverage over each other. Over the last century, we've moved in a direction away from that. We saw it particularly in the emphasis on globalism, the idea of eliminating poverty throughout the world, relying on an economic system which theoretically would raise all boats and potentially eliminate poverty in the world, make people more equal. All of these things that were goals, stated goals of our international affairs, of our international priorities, have now been put on the back burner. And instead, we're talking about independent individual trade deals, one nation with another. Hard negotiations. Negotiations which produce a winner. I can't help but remembering throughout the campaign, candidate Trump promising that if he's elected, we're going to win so often it's going to become boring. If you are out to totally defeat your competitor, then I'd suggest to you the ability to work in the future with that competitor becomes less likely. I would suggest that's what we're really talking about here. I really don't have anything else to say about this except to recommend this article. On my copy of it, in the margin at the top, I put the following equation. At the time I read this was the reaction I got. This is the equation I put on paper. Untruth is to lies as anger is to contempt. Remember when everybody was using the word falsehoods, talking about the falsehoods? Nobody would use the word lie because lie is cruel. When you accuse somebody of lying, you're implying intent, even if you can't prove it. But if you're talking falsehood or untruths, you're talking about things that don't square with the evidence, that don't compute with fact. But you're not implying intent. In other words, you're suggesting to the other party that you're wrong. That's what you're saying isn't the facts. This is what the facts are. So in a sense, falsehoods or untruths is quite a bit different than lie, because lie implies intent. Likewise, the difference between anger and contempt. Anger is disagreement, even heated disagreement, on a particular issue between people or groups. But the fact of the matter is, people can be angry at each other, but not have contempt for each other. When you have contempt for your opponent, you dismiss them and dehumanize them. It's much worse. It is as far away from anger as a lie is from a falsehood. And I think that's the point which all of us need to keep in mind. We're moving toward the end of our program. I'm going to check the time here, but it seems to me we are at 57 minutes after the hour. We've got less than 3 minutes to go in our program. I want to thank you for tuning in to the Virtual Center today. We'll be back again tomorrow. I want to remind you that tomorrow, being Tuesday, we will begin 1/2 hour later than we did today. And most important of all, let me remind you, I did this at the beginning of our first hour, that Wednesday will be a repeat program. And so will next week's programs. We'll be running archived programs from the past. Agnes is going through the archives, and she's going to be selecting the programs that she feels would be most pertinent at this particular time, given the kinds of things that are happening. As I mentioned, I'll be leaving town. I will be back middle of next week, and we will resume the following week after that with our regular schedule. But I did want to mention that. I want to thank you for tuning in today. I appreciate it. I appreciate your continued support for this program, and most important of all, your continued support for the Head On Radio Network. I want to thank you. I want to encourage you to have a wonderful evening. Be safe. Be kind to each other. And hopefully we'll see you tomorrow here at the Virtual Center. Thank you.